Hello everybody, thank you for attending today's webinar. We'll just wait a couple more minutes for others to join and then we will get started.
Hopefully everybody's enjoying the nice weather we're having. I think we're getting a longer summer this year than we have for a while, so long may it continue.
Fingers crossed.
Indeed.
Fingers crossed. Right, I'll wait in another minute and then we will go.
Yeah, some familiar faces on the webinar, but also some new ones. So welcome. Appreciate your time, as Isabel said, and hopefully we'll get through the next 35 minutes or so with bit of an update and obviously some sort of Q&As throughout. So yeah, no, thank you again for your time.
Throughout the webinar, if anybody has a question, just pop it in the chat and then Michael or myself will help answer it at the end.
There's a few more people joining us now, isn't there? Probably just running a little bit late from the previous meeting, so we'll give it a minute or so, and then we'll kick on and start the webinar.
Right, let's get started and people can join as they come. So, hi everybody, thank you for joining today's webinar. So I'm just going to do a little introduction of who me and Michael are and what the webinar will be about today. So welcome to the webinar for Danbro Umbrella's webinar on the 2026 Umbrella Reform and what this means for MSPs and neutral vendors. We are joined today by myself, I'm Isabel from marketing at the Danbro Group, and Michael, who is our head of sales at Danbro Umbrella. Today we are following up on the HMRC updates which happened on the 21st of July regarding the changes and what will be done to tackle non-compliance within the umbrella market. So we'll focus on specific references such as the primary agency and also talk about the key changes to liability for underpaid taxes, including NIC, which moves towards joint and several liability, not just with the umbrella company. So we'll also touch on the meeting we held recently with the FCSA CEO Chris Brace to better understand the implications, especially in relation to MSP and neutral vendors and the liability and how to approach this compliance moving forward. So today is where we are breaking down the key takeaways both from the FCSA and HMRC. So Michael, we have a list of most asked questions that we need help answering with today. So to kick this off, I'm going to ask you a question. So what are the key changes announced and why do they matter for MSPs and vendors?
Yeah, thanks, Isabel. Hi, everyone. I suppose just to give a little bit of background, there was obviously been quite a lot of noise over the last 3, 4, 5 weeks since the government confirmed changes in the reform for April 2026, and I think there's been a lot of feedback from key stakeholders, industry leaders, and government bodies to guide the government in terms of which direction that they'll be travelling towards. And I suppose the real big outcome towards the back end of July was the joint and several liability will come into play in April 2026.
Yeah.
In its current form, if an umbrella company, and we've seen it over the number of years umbrella companies have been engaged in certain sectors, if there is a shortfall, if the incorrect levels of tax, national insurance isn't paid, in its current format, the liability sits with that umbrella company. However, with the joint and several liability changes coming into play, there's going to be more than one entity that's liable if there is a shortfall. Now, some of the audience that's on the webinar today, you will act as an agency, but you could also act as an MSP or a neutral vendor, depending on the supply chain given. So I think the reason and the focus that today's webinar is about neutral vendors and MSPs is that it's the top level entity who is the one that's closest to the client will hold the primary liability with the umbrella company. So we feel that this is really relevant in the MSP and neutral vendor space, is that you could, if you're an MSP, you could lean on some second tier sourcing agencies to supply work if you're not filling all the vacancies, and they may have their own PSL. If you're a neutral vendor, Typically, you don't recruit, you manage the supply chain. And again, you rely on sourcing agencies that you engage with to have a PSL and obviously engage with umbrella companies. So there's a real big shift. There's a real big change in terms of liability. And for those that are on the webinar today, obviously got to be a review in terms of processes, risk profile, and ultimately, just to maybe understand these changes in a little bit more detail. So I think in summary, HMRC has scope to pursue any party in the supply chain if there's incorrect levels of tax or national insurance. But the main focus in terms of the joint and several liability will be the umbrella company in question and the primary agency or the primary entity closest to the end client. So naturally, if you're an MSP or you're a neutral vendor on this webinar today, that would definitely put you in that joint and several liable place. And in the normal circumstances, if you've got a sourcing agency, if you're an MSP, or if you've got a neutral vendor and you've got agencies, that wouldn't include that agency. That would include you and the umbrella company. So it's becoming even more apparent now that the suppliers that you engage with have the same level of vested interest and level of risk appetite that you have to make sure that then barriers are set as high as they possibly should be. And I think initial reactions from the FCSA webinar we hosted last week was that this represents a significant compliance tightening across the board. There's obviously a variety of audience and members on the webinar today, is that you will have different sectors that you're specialist in. I think across certain sectors, there's a real conscious effort to make sure that compliance is adhered to from top to bottom. And in other sectors, there may well be a little bit of a lesser bar in terms of who suppliers use and why they use them. So we believe this will be a real positive step forward across the board.
Fabulous. Okay. So to get into specifics then, so why might MSPs and the framework be at risk even if they don't directly place workers?
Yeah, and I think this is really important for the audience that's on the call today. Clearly, if you're an MSP, you may well be able to recruit majority of the roles yourself. You may well have your own preferred supplier list of umbrella companies, and you have your own level of expectations in terms of what that compliance criteria looks like. But if you're an MSP and you lean on sourcing agencies to fill certain roles, to fill certain programs and clients that you may not be able to fulfill directly, the natural engagement, and I've been working in this space for probably about 15, 16 years, is that I think the natural flow is, if I use sourcing agencies, as long as they use FCSA approved umbrella companies, then I'm fairly relaxed and I'm fairly comfortable. Because at the moment, the liability sits with that umbrella company. Going forward, MSPs will be the joint and several liable partner with the umbrella company, not the sourcing agency. So I believe there'll be a huge review of policies and processes for MSPs that use sourcing agencies. I also think and believe, given my experiences, that neutral vendors, again, maybe have a similar message. The sourcing agencies that they rely on to fulfill client programs is that maybe they have to be FCSA approved, or maybe they have to be professional passport accredited. But ultimately, the neutral vendor who's got the closest relationship with the client and the umbrella company will be the two companies that will be joint and liable, severally liable, should there be any shortfall of any tax or national insurance, not the sourcing agency themselves. HMRC were very quick to point out that if there's no UK-based agency, then the liability would shift up towards the client. We know that probably since COVID, the last four or 5 years, there's been a real engagement and presence of global supply chains and businesses that being able to support overseas payroll. So HMRC were very quick to point out that if there's no UK entity present, then the liability would shift up the supply chain to the end user and the end client. So that was a specific reference from the government a few weeks ago.
Right, okay. So how could these rules impact the use of agency PAYE versus the umbrella models like Danbro Umbrella?
Yeah, no, I think this was a really big point that was pushed and referenced on the webinar last week with FCSA. Is if you're an MSP and you have a sourcing agency that's supplying workers, or you're a neutral vendor and you use agencies to find, recruit and payroll workers, sometimes these agencies will put workers on their payroll. They won't use umbrella companies. Maybe that's down to rate of pay. Maybe that's down to a client requirement, or
Yeah.
maybe that's just because candidate doesn't want to use an umbrella company. At the moment, the joint and several liability is between the MSP and the recruitment agency. So if the agency's PAYE process doesn't take into account all of the right taxes and national insurance, then the MSP or neutral vendor and the agency are jointly and several liable. That's currently already in place for the PAYE workers. So I think if you have an additional option where contractors can get paid via an umbrella company and the umbrella
Yeah.
company is doing everything correctly, becomes a bit of a circuit breaker here. So the joint and several liable partners will be the umbrella company and the MSP, or the umbrella company and the agency closest to the client if there isn't one. So I think it replicates the current joint and several liable options that's there for any agencies that have workers on their payroll.
Okay.
We may well see clients or MSPs potentially push more workers towards an umbrella option, for those that are doing it compliantly, for those that are making sure the right levels of tax, national insurance are being deducted. And we could see less and less PAYE workers being payrolled through an agency. This also ties in with the Employment Rights Bill, where the government are reviewing that worker status, which a lot of contractors who are paid through an agency are typically on. So I think there's a lot of moving parts,
Yeah.
but I also think that with this joint and several liability, I think the ones that are taking ownership and taking the responsibility, I think that may well seem to be a potential avenue to engage with more umbrella companies that are doing things correctly.
Right. Okay. So, Michael, this is just one from me. So, I've heard the term purported umbrellas. What are they exactly, and like how are they fitting into all of this?
Yeah, it was an interesting word that the government used
Yeah.
towards the back end of July. Um, so I think the easiest analogy is if a company is acting like an umbrella company,
Yeah.
but maybe not saying that they are an umbrella company, then this also covers them as well. So this is
Okay.
probably to try and stop companies trying to bring out new services, new solutions, but not identifying them as an umbrella company.
Right. Okay.
So
Right.
the analogy is if you walk like a duck and you talk like a duck, you're probably a duck underneath. So just because you don't call yourself an umbrella company doesn't mean that you can get around these sort of joint and several
Right.
liability. So you may well see outsourced PEO, professional employment organisations.
Okay.
You might see different types of engagements. If it's classed within the term of a purported umbrella, then the joint and several liability rules will still apply. So I
Right.
think the government are quite clear in saying that the definition of an umbrella company has now been extended to include employment businesses. So it's important to know that just because you may not deem yourself as an umbrella company, if you do a lot of the things that umbrella companies do, such as payroll, employment, etc., then this joint and several liability will still incorporate you as well.
Right. Okay. All right. So just before I go on, if anybody has any questions, please pop them in the chat and Michael will answer them at the very end. So my next question is, well, what about the employer reference then? So that's been clarified too, hasn't it?
Yeah, thankfully, I think one of the nervousness around these proposed changes was that there would have to be individual unique reference numbers for each of the employees that were engaged through an umbrella model. Thankfully,
Right.
again, based on government feedback, stakeholder feedback, is that the amount of time and
Yeah.
software and systems that would need to be implemented and
Yeah.
integrated into businesses, that would just either take a lot of time and wouldn't be in place for April 26, or it just wouldn't be fit for purpose. So
Yeah.
I think what the government have confirmed is that umbrellas will work as they do now. They will use their own PAYE reference number for all of their employees. And I suppose it's a win for legitimate business umbrella companies that are doing things correctly, and they don't have to spend hours, spend time, spend costs to, I suppose, reinvent the wheel, when it's actually, for those that are doing things correctly, it's actually a sign of a win really for the
Yeah.
legitimate umbrella company. So yeah, the employee reference number will remain as it is. It will remain as the
Okay.
umbrella's PAYE reference number, rather than having individual ones for each individual employee of that umbrella company.
Right. Okay. Right. So this one, well, how, for anyone who wasn't on our webinar 2 weeks ago with the FCSA, so how have the FCSA responded to these changes?
Yeah, I think in a very, very similar way to Danbro. Chris and Deb were on the FCSA webinar with us last week, is that,
Yeah.
they both described this as a positive and welcome step for the industry.
Okay.
I've been doing this role I've been in this industry for about 15, 16 years. And the biggest challenge I have, and the biggest challenge a lot of our competitors have, who are doing things in the right way,
Yeah.
is non-compliant providers.
Yeah.
Historically, you might hear of the workers getting paid in Isle of Man or offshore, or in a weird and wonderful, convoluted way. And
Hmm.
while that has been reduced over time, the biggest challenge we've got is when we're competing with non-compliant providers in certain sectors, probably more rife than others,
Yeah.
where the demand is that high, is that if people don't get paid, then they'll just go to another agency, and they will put them through that provider. So I think for us, it's about, this reform is aimed at restoring confidence in the umbrella world,
Yeah.
making sure that the companies that are engaged and doing things correctly, will help work collaboratively with recruitment agencies, MSPs, and neutral vendors, to make sure that, if you do have contractors that are being payrolled through Danbro umbrella or other umbrella companies that do things correctly, then there's that confidence there that there'll be no shortfall in tax, national insurance, and there won't be a liability being passed up the supply chain.
Right, okay. So with all of this information then, so say for anybody on here who is an MSP or neutral vendor, what advice would you give them today to get ahead of all of these changes and get ahead of, you know, what's coming?
Yeah, and I think that, again, thank you for everybody for attending. Obviously, I know it's a very busy time, with everything that's going on with this and the Employment Rights Bill, and everything else with the government of rolling out. I think for me, this can't be put on the mid to long term. This can't be let's do this towards Christmas time, or let's pick this up in the new year. April 2026 feels a long time away. I think if you're in the neutral vendor space, or you're in the MSP world, you've got really potentially large programs that you're supporting clients with. A change in process or a change in policy isn't a quick fix. These supply chains can have a number of entities across the board. Obviously, you've got, summer period now, and then obviously there's a Christmas period in a few months. So there's going to be an element where people are going to be on annual leave. They're going to be out of the business. So I do think there is an element of businesses who act early, and like any legislation change, Isabel, the companies that act early are the ones that prosper, and the ones that get
Yeah.
ahead of the curve, that ultimately April 26 will just become the norm.
Hmm.
It won't be a case of I've got to do this and I've got to do this. It'll just be a case of a phased approach, and make sure that, that they're working in conjunction with what HMRC would like.
Yeah.
So I suppose in terms of what Danbro have been doing already to get ahead of the curve and ahead of the changes, that we've been FCSA members for probably 20 years. In addition to that, we're now also VeryPay accredited.
Yeah.
For those businesses on the webinar that I'm not sure of what VeryPay is FCSA's pay slipping check-in service. So this allows you to have transparency throughout the supply chain. So not only the remittance that you send on to us, but the payments and the pay slip that we pay the worker, and also the PAYE RTI payments that we make to HMRC, you'll be able to make sure that all of that is transparent from top to bottom. I think historically, businesses have asked for annual audits or quarterly audits of, can you send me an example payslip, or can you fill in an RFI, information about your company. I think that level of requirement will be supercharged, because you can't let it go that period of time without finding out what your suppliers are doing. But also, if you're now going to be joint and severally liable, this should be an ongoing process, not just an annual or quarterly process. There could be a pay slipping check-in service every week, or
Hmm.
every month. Danbro, I believe, I've been speaking to a number of businesses over the past 6 months on this, and there's a huge consensus that PSLs and supplies will get reduced, and there'll be a lot more tighter controls. There's obviously a lot of people on today's webinar that you may have engage with umbrella companies, and you might have a preferred supplier list yourself, and you might have salespeople that have got an opportunity to bring business in, and that there's exceptions and there's exceptional processes, and you work outside sometimes of the PSL to get the business in. I think going forward, I think the exceptions will be very exceptional. I think, the PSL is there for a reason, and I think it just allows tighter control, greater relationships
Yeah,
and added
definitely.
value.
Yeah.
I think, if you've got a preferred supplier list of any more than 5 or 6, there should be and then you've got maybe a tail of companies that you've got ones and twos with. I think what we've been speaking to a lot of stakeholders and business owners is that over the course of the next 3 to 6 months, they'll be phased off and they'll be phased to the PSL, because ultimately, whether you're an MSP, an agency, or a neutral vendor, there's likely to be an additional layer of risk and liability that you never had before. So where there was an exception process that was probably something you wouldn't want to do, but was accepted, it's definitely going to be an option where you probably don't want to do it because the liability will increase from what it is now. So for me, we see a huge PSL condense. So you'll probably see fewer supplies engaged and a lot more tighter control. So I think for me, this is for MSPs and neutral vendors who don't necessarily have direct engagements with the umbrella companies that are payrolling the workers. There's likely a sourcing agency or an agency in the way. It's to make sure that you fully understand what the processes are and the risk appetite is, and whether it's the same level of what yours is.
Right. Okay, so with all that then, how would you say Danbro can help then? How would you say that we can help as a company to these MSPs and these neutral vendors?
And we've been making waves across a number of services over the last couple of years to get ahead of the curve. So I've mentioned we've got Veripay accreditation. We've also, we've got financial stability and longevity in the marketplace. So, we've gone through MSC legislation, we've gone through I-35 legislation, we've gone through TNS legislation, and I think that demonstrates, that our business is built, future-proof for the business. It doesn't just sort of come and go. We're not here just for a short period. We've been doing this a long time and been able to pivot and navigate a lot of challenging legislation changes. And this is only going to be another one. But I feel that Danbro can help businesses because of that experience we've got. We've got financial stability. I think there's maybe businesses will want to have a closer look at companies' financial stability, strength, and how well that they can support the wider supply chain. Veripay accreditation, I think, is going to be crucial. I think if you've got a business that hasn't got that visibility of where the funds are being paid to and from, you're probably going to ask you question yourself as to why not. Why aren't they able to be open and transparent, or why are they not wanting to move forward in a place that a lot of other businesses are? And I think one of the other things that I really wanted to sort of show MSPs and neutral vendors who are on the webinar today is that at Danbro, we're in a fortunate position where we foresee the potential of agency margin only potentially being an avenue to minimise this liability. So I don't know whether you want to bring up a slide, just so I can maybe share this to the
I think it's
webinar.
up.
Is it okay? Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
So bear with me. Yeah, sorry. So if everybody on the webinar can see the slide on the left, again, every supply chain is very different. But if you have a look at your current end hirer and you're either the MSP or the neutral vend, you typically have engagements with supplying or sourcing agencies who then onwardly supply funds either directly to the worker if they're on agency contract. You either then pay a limited company if they're outside I-35, or the funds that get passed on to an umbrella company who then pay the worker. So you can see that from the end hirer's perspective and the MSP's perspective, they don't have naturally any engagement with the worker. There's obviously a number of entities down the supply chain. Where we believe Danbro can add quite a lot of value from is we've got technology, we've got the capability to be able to provide margin-only capability. So if you look at the proposed future state that we believe that some MSPs and neutral vendors will potentially consider, is that instead of the MSP having a number of sourcing agencies that they pay currently to, they could pass on that assignment income to Danbro. What Danbro can then do is a couple of things, is that we can pay that sourcing agency margin only. They would be outside of the supply chain, and the onward supply of funds would then be managed and controlled by the MSP and Danbro. So we could onwardly pay Danbro Umbrella Company, we could pay Trafalgar Umbrella Company, we could pay a number of other umbrella companies that meet certain criteria that meets that MSP liability. And fundamentally, what that means is that there's an element here of mitigating that risk, managing the changes that HMRC are putting on MSPs and neutral vendors. And this isn't new. Businesses do agency margin only on certain programs, and some may be able to do it themselves. But Danbro are in a fortunate position. If you are an MSP or you're a neutral vendor and you don't have this capability, or you don't want to get involved in passing some money to the agency and onward funds to certain umbrella companies, at Danbro are in a fortunate position that we can do this. There could be potential cost savings as well. But as I say, for us, I think going back to your original question is how can we help? Is that
Yeah.
if businesses are concerned or want to know what options are available for them to mitigate that risk, and we never say we'll remove it, because risk is a part of dealing with business. We're in a position that we can work with you as the MSP or work with you as the neutral vend to be able to explore which businesses you'd be comfortable with in making sure that the right levels of tax and national insurance is being deducted, rather than it just being, have you got this accreditation or have you got that accreditation? We can obviously work closely with you and your team to be able to make sure that you're comfortable with that risk analysis and that risk profile.
Great. Okay. So can I stop sharing the screen?
Yeah, sure.
So that is all the questions that we've pre-had and that people have sent in that wanted to be asked. So do you want to pop on to the other questions that people have asked in the chat and the Q&A now?
Yeah, no, that'd be great. I'll have
Fab.
a quick
Okay.
look. It's just been.
Do you want me to read them out for you?
Yeah, no, that's fine if you can.
So Sophie has said, what if there are connected companies that have different entities within the supply chain? So what does that mean?
Yeah, I think there's historically there are recruitment agencies that maybe have umbrella company connections. There's neutral vendors and MSPs that have, they do more than one thing. And while everybody's doing everything they can, HMRC brought up this in the legislation, is that if there's two entities that are connected either by directorship or shareholders, then there would then be an addition. There would be, the liability would then be shared with the recruitment agency. So if you've got an MSP or a neutral vendor that also has an umbrella company associated with them, you couldn't be therefore marking your own homework, if that makes sense. You couldn't be joint and severally liable because you'd be the same company. So
Yeah.
it would also involve the recruitment agency or the client within that supply chain who would be jointly and severally liable. So I think from our perspective, it's a case to show that, we're in a position of VeriPay accreditation. We've got financial backing and support. So for us, this is all about making sure that whoever we work with and whoever wants to work with Danbro, we can make sure that the liability is managed in its best format and make sure that everything's done to what HMRC would require.
Okay. Hope that answered your question, Sophie. So we do have one in the Q&A. It's just currently loading. Oh, we've got a couple in the Q&A. So
Yeah.
Becky has asked, what 3 key things should suppliers look for when engaging with an umbrella company?
Yeah, thanks, Becky. I think for me, there's obviously quite a number of things that businesses can consider, but I think for me, the first one is, have you worked with that business before? Do you have trading history with that business before? How long has that business been around this industry and this sector? So for me, that shows that they're credible, they're able to deal with the demands of legislation, and they're also able to pivot and make changes to meet the demands of HMRC changes. Financial stability is one, length of engagement is one. And also for me, do you trust that business? Do you know the people who work in that business? Do you have
Yeah.
on-site visits rather than just paperwork that comes in via email and attachments? Does that business allow you to come on site and go through their processes rigorously and making sure that they're doing exactly what you would want them to do as a supplier? So probably mentioned a few more than 3, but hopefully it gives you the gist that, for me, this isn't just a tick box exercise. And if you've
Yeah.
got a certain accreditation, then that kind of ticks the box going forward, because I
Says
definitely don't
itself.
think that'll be it.
Yeah, it speaks for itself.
Yeah.
So Deirdre has said, why has Danbro decided to go with VeriPay over SafeRec when latter seem to be further advanced?
Yeah, I've had a couple of people ask a similar sort of question around sort of, VeriPay and other payslip checking services. Is that, I think a couple of things is that Danbro have always been FCSA members, and I think for us and
Always.
majority of the people on this webinar, I think FCSA has always been that sort of golden stamp and that sort of golden compliance stamp that businesses need, and certain clients now demand FCSA accredited requirement. So if we've got FCSA within our blood and we've been doing what they say for a number of years, VeriPay is a bit of a bolt-on, a bit of an added feature to the FCSA accreditation. So for us, we've always gone down the FCSA route, and if they've got a pay slipping checking facility, then that kind of mirrors the demands of what we've always wanted. I've got no real negatives around other payslip checking services. I know a lot of other businesses are doing a lot of great things. And I think for me, this isn't about what's right and what's wrong. This is about what meets you as a business in terms of your risk appetite. If VeriPay and other pay checking services meet your risk profile, then that's absolutely great. I think whoever you choose to go with, Deirdre, as a business, whether it's VeriPay, SafeRec, or any other, as long as you're comfortable in ensuring that the risk is being managed, then I think you've ticked the box. There's a duty of care as a business to be able to make sure that you've got businesses and processes in place to meet the demand of change in legislation. So yeah, whoever you as a business decide to go with, as long as they're doing what you would expect them to do and they're ticking the right boxes, then as I say, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just, I think you've got to either have one or the other. You can't have nothing, and you can't have the process maybe that you've had historically, where it may have not been a payslip checking facility, where they might have just asked for maybe random pay slips or annual checks. There's got to be, I think, a little bit of a level in terms of which pay slipping service you should be using.
Brilliant. So we've got one last one. So are there sectors that will likely be more affected than other?
I think for me, financial services, I think they made the big move in 2020, that even though I-35 was delayed. And I think, there's a lot of volume and contract that have been doing the use of umbrella companies for the last 4 or 5 years. I think, insurance and highly regulated sectors, I think they've really, really stepped up in terms of using compliant providers.
Yeah.
I think there are a couple of sectors that probably find the use of non-compliant umbrella companies a little bit more rife. So if you're in the healthcare or medical sector, if you're in the construction sector, if you're in maybe the educational sector where the demand is really, really high, there seems to be, and speaking to a lot of people in them audiences, is that if agencies don't allow the worker to get paid by a certain company, then they'll lose the business as such, and they'll just go to another provider. So I think for me, certain sectors have been getting ahead of this curve a lot quicker. That being said, there is still a long list of non-PSL members that are being used by some of the big recruitment agencies, MSPs and neutral vendors. And I think as we see over the next 6 to 9 months, we'll see that tail narrow off. We'll see the non-PSL members for that program or that client be removed, because the whole point of having a PSL is that you've got audits, you understand who you work with,
Yeah.
they meet your commercial requirements, you know the people personally. So I think for me, all sectors will be impacted, some more than others, but I just feel that there'll be a lot of consolidation in the market. There'll be a lot of businesses that, were previously, they've said, oh, do you know what, we'll have an exception process, we'll do this. I think for me, with this joint and several liability, I don't think there'll be as much as an exception process going forward. There might be the odd one or two from a business case perspective, but I just feel that if you are aware of the joint and several liability in terms of tax, national insurance, you want to make sure that you're doing everything you can within your remit to control that risk as best you possibly can.
Definitely. Okay, thank you for that as well. So does anybody else have any questions that they want to ask before we end the webinar? Give it a few seconds. I think we'll take that as a no. So thank you so much to everybody who has attended today. We have left contact details within the chat box. So if you want to get in touch with Michael or myself or the inquiries inbox, all the information is in there for you guys. Thank you so much.
Thanks for your time, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
I sound, hang on.